Have you ever heard of a kingdom ruled by slaves? It sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but for centuries this was the reality in Egypt. This was the world of the Mamluks. The word Mamluk itself means one who is owned in Arabic. They were boys, often from the steppes of Central Asia or the Caucasus Mountains, captured in war or bought in slave markets. They were not just any slaves though. These young men were chosen for their strength and resilience. They were brought to Egypt and trained in the art of war, becoming the most elite soldiers of their time. They were fiercely loyal, not to a country, but to their masters and to their fellow Mamluk brothers. This unique system created a powerful military class that eventually took power for itself. Imagine a society where the path to the throne wasn't through bloodline, but through military might and political cunning. That was the Mamluk Sultanate. In 1250, they seized control of Egypt and Syria, establishing a dynasty that would last for nearly 300 years. They were the warriors who famously defeated the seemingly unstoppable Mongol armies at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, a pivotal moment in world history. They were also great patrons of the arts and architecture. The skyline of modern Cairo is still dominated by the magnificent mosques, schools and fortresses they built. The Mamluks created a vibrant and powerful empire, a beacon of Islamic civilization during a turbulent period. But this system, built on violence and loyalty, was also inherently unstable. The Mamluks were divided into different households, each loyal to a powerful emir or commander. This created constant rivalries and power struggles. A sultan's reign was often a precarious balancing act, trying to keep these ambitious and heavily armed factions from turning on him. It was a world of intrigue, betrayal, and sudden violence. A sultan could be celebrated one day and assassinated the next. It is into this dangerous, glittering world that our story's subject, a young boy named Faraj, was born. He was not a slave soldier himself, but the son of a sultan, which in the Mamluk world was both a great privilege and a terrible burden. His life would be shaped by the very system his ancestors had perfected. Understanding the Mamluks is key to understanding the incredible story of Sultan Nasir al-Din Faraj. His reign was a microcosm of the Mamluk experience, a life lived on the edge, defined by brutal warfare, internal rebellion, and the constant threat of being overthrown. The Mamluks were not just rulers, they were a warrior brotherhood, a military machine that had taken over a state. Their story is one of incredible achievement and spectacular failure. They saved the Middle East from the Mongols but often tore their own kingdom apart. Faraj's life is perhaps the most dramatic example of this paradox, a tale of a boy who inherited a storm and spent his entire life trying to survive it. In the year 1399, the Mamluk Sultanate was in a state of high alert. The powerful and great Sultan Barkuk was a formidable ruler who had himself risen from the Mamluk ranks, lay dying in his magnificent citadel in Cairo. Barkuk had been a force of nature, a clever leader who had successfully navigated the treacherous currents of Mamluk politics to rule for 2 separate reigns. He had fought off his rivals and kept the empire stable. But now, as his life ebbed away, a great fear settled over the capital. Who could possibly replace him? Who could hold the powerful rival Mamluk emirs in check? The answer was, to many, deeply worrying. It was his son, Faraj. Faraj was only 10 years old. In a world where power was earned through battlefield experience and political maneuvering, placing a child on the throne was a massive gamble. The Mamluk system was not designed for hereditary rule in the way European monarchies were. A sultan's son was often seen as a weak link, lacking the hard-won respect and personal loyalty of the Mamluk warriors. But Faraj's father had been determined to establish a dynasty. On his deathbed, he made his most powerful emirs swear an oath of loyalty to his young son. They were to act as his guardians, his regents, and guide the boy until he was old enough to rule in his own right. The oath was sworn, and upon his death, the young boy was proclaimed Sultan Nasir al-Din Faraj. His name meant Victor of the Faith, Relief. It was a hopeful name, but one that would prove to be tragically ironic. From the very beginning, his reign was not his own. He was a pawn in a game, played by men who were far older, more experienced, and infinitely more ruthless. 2 of the most powerful emirs, Itmish and Tagrabirdi, were appointed to lead his council of regents. They had sworn to protect him, but in reality, they were rivals, each seeing the boy sultan as a stepping stone to their own supreme power. For the young Faraj, the citadel of Cairo must have felt less like a palace and more like a gilded cage. He was surrounded by luxury and ceremony, addressed with the grandest titles, but he held no real authority. Every decision was made for him by the Council of Emirs. These men, who were supposed to be his protectors, were constantly plotting against one another. The court was a hotbed of whispers, conspiracies, and shifting alliances. Faraj grew up watching these powerful men, learning about power not from a textbook, but from observing the brutal, real-world struggle happening all around him. This early education in treachery and survival would shape the man and the ruler he was to become. Just as the Mamluk court was consumed by its own internal power struggles, a storm was gathering on the horizon. This was no ordinary threat. It came in the form of one of history's most terrifying conquerors, Timur, also known in the West as Tamerlane. From his capital in Samarkand, Timur had built a vast empire stretching across Central Asia, Persia, and into India. He was a brilliant military strategist, but also a man of unimaginable cruelty. His campaigns were legendary for their scale and their brutality. Cities that defied him were not just conquered, they were annihilated, their populations massacred, and pyramids of skulls were built as a warning to others. And now, in the year 1400, Timur had turned his attention towards the Mamluk Sultanate. The news of Timur's advance sent a wave of panic through Egypt and Syria. Refugees began pouring south, telling horrific stories of Timur's unstoppable army and the devastation it left in its wake. The Mamluk emirs, who had been busy plotting against each other, were suddenly forced to confront a terrifying external enemy. The very survival of their empire was at stake. For the young Sultan Faraj, now around 11 years old, this was his first great test. He was the Sultan, the symbolic leader of the empire, and he was expected to lead the army to confront this great threat. The regents, Itmish and Tagribirdi, knew that a display of unity was essential. They gathered a massive Mamluk army and began the long march north from Cairo into Syria. The young Sultan Faraj rode with them, a boy in golden armor at the head of a force of veteran warriors. It must have been an incredible and terrifying sight for him. This was not a parade. It was a march to war against a legendary foe. The Mamluk army was one of the finest in the world, famed for its heavy cavalry and discipline. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, in their ability to defeat any enemy. They had stopped the Mongols after all, but Timur was a different kind of challenge. He was a master of strategy, and his army was a diverse and disciplined war machine. The two armies finally drew near to each other outside the ancient city of Damascus. The tension was immense. The fate of the entire region hung in the balance. But what happened next was not a great, pitched battle. Instead, it was a moment of pure, Mamluk political chaos. Just as they were preparing to face Timur, word reached the Mamluk camp of a new plot back in Cairo. A group of emirs was planning to overthrow Faraj's government. Fearful of losing their power base back home, the rival regents Itmish and Tagribirdi made a disastrous decision. They abandoned the campaign. Taking the young sultan with them, they turned the army around and raced back to Cairo to secure their power, leaving Syria and the city of Damascus completely defenseless. The decision to abandon Damascus was a catastrophic betrayal. The great Mamluk army, which had marched north with such pomp and confidence, simply vanished, leaving the citizens of Damascus to face the wrath of Timur alone. Imagine the terror and disbelief that must have swept through the city. Their protectors were gone. They were trapped. Timur and his vast army wasted no time in surrounding the ancient city, one of the jewels of the Islamic world. The city's governor and the remaining garrison knew that resistance was futile against such overwhelming odds. They hoped that by negotiating a swift surrender, they could save Damascus from the brutal fate that had befallen other cities. The city leaders opened the gates and agreed to pay a huge ransom to Timur, a massive tribute of gold, goods, and weapons, in exchange for sparing the city and its people. For a short while, it seemed the strategy might have worked. Timur's soldiers entered the city peacefully, and the handover of the ransom began. Timur himself met with the city's scholars and dignitaries, engaging them in debates about religion and history. He seemed for a moment to be a man of culture, not just a brutal conqueror. But this was a cruel deception. The calm was merely the prelude to a storm of unimaginable horror and destruction. Once the ransom had been paid, and the city had been stripped of its defenses, the mask came off. under the pretext that the ransom was not enough or that some of his soldiers had been attacked, Timur unleashed his army on the helpless city. For 3 days, Damascus was subjected to an orgy of violence, plunder and fire. Soldiers went from house to house, killing, looting, and enslaving the population. The great Umayyad Mosque, one of the holiest sites in Islam, was stripped of its treasures and then set ablaze. The fires raged for days, consuming libraries, markets, and homes, turning vast swathes of the beautiful city into a smoldering ruin. The sack of Damascus was a deep wound, a humiliation from which the Mamluk Sultanate would never fully recover. The stories of the atrocities spread throughout the empire, a testament to the weakness and division of the Mamluk leadership. Timur's forces rounded up the city's finest artisans, craftsmen, and scholars, and forcibly marched them back to his capital, Samarkand, robbing Syria of a generation of its talent. For Sultan Faraj, who had been whisked away from the battlefield, the news must have been devastating. He was the Sultan, yet he had been powerless to prevent one of his greatest cities from being utterly destroyed. The shadow of Damascus would hang over his entire reign, a symbol of his failure and the treachery of his guardians. Returning to Cairo after the disaster in Damascus did not bring stability. In fact, it only intensified the power struggles that had been brewing since the start of Faraj's reign. The emirs who had abandoned Syria to protect their positions in Egypt now turned on each other with renewed ferocity. The court of the young sultan became a battleground. The two main rivals, Itmish and Tagrabirdi, along with another powerful emir named Yashbak, openly fought for control of the government. They purged each other's supporters, seized fortunes, and engaged in street battles in the heart of Cairo. The city itself became a checkerboard of rival factions, with citizens living in constant fear of the next outbreak of violence. For Faraj, these years were a masterclass in survival. He was now a teenager, no longer a child, and he was beginning to understand the deadly game being played around him. He learned to play the emirs against one another, subtly shifting his favor from one to the next, ensuring that no single faction became powerful enough to depose him entirely. It was a dangerous and exhausting strategy. In 1405, the chaos reached a tipping point. A group of emirs, led by Yashbak and a Circassian emir named Sheikh al-Mahmudi, staged a successful coup. They briefly deposed Faraj and placed his infant brother, Abd al-Aziz, on the throne. Faraj was imprisoned in the citadel, his short and turbulent reign seemingly over. But in the Mamluk world, nothing was ever final. The alliance that had overthrown Faraj quickly fell apart. Sheikh and Yashbak became rivals, and after only a few months of chaos, Faraj's supporters saw an opportunity. They staged a counter-coup, freed Faraj from his prison, and restored him to the Sultanate. He was Sultan once more, but the experience had changed him. He was no longer a boy being manipulated by his guardians. He was a young man who had been overthrown and had fought his way back to power. He was now determined to rule in his own right, to crush the emirs who had betrayed him, and to finally impose his own authority on the fractured kingdom. His second reign began with a wave of retribution. Faraj, now more ruthless and decisive, moved against the emirs who had conspired against him. He had some of them executed, others imprisoned or exiled. He was trying to break the power of the great households that had dominated his youth. For a time, it seemed to work. He managed to assert a degree of personal control that he had never known before. However, the problem was that the Mamluk system was built on these powerful emirs. By trying to destroy them, he was also destroying the pillars of his own military and political support. He was creating a power vacuum, and making countless enemies in the process. As if the political chaos and constant threat of rebellion were not enough, Sultan Faraj's Egypt was soon struck by a series of natural disasters that brought the kingdom to its knees. The first of these was a catastrophic failure of the Nile flood. For centuries, Egypt's very existence had depended on the annual inundation of the Nile, which deposited fertile silt on the fields and allowed for bountiful harvests. But in 1403, and for several years following, the flood was dangerously low. The fields dried up, the crops withered, and the grain stores were quickly depleted. The country plunged into a devastating famine, one of the worst in its long history. The scenes in Cairo and across the countryside were, honestly, horrific. Chronicles from the time speak of widespread starvation. The price of bread skyrocketed to levels that no ordinary person could afford. People were seen eating dogs, cats, and even, in the most desperate cases, resorting to cannibalism. The social order began to break down completely. Law and order collapsed as starving mobs roamed the streets, looting bakeries and the homes of the wealthy. The government, consumed by its own internal conflicts and with its treasury drained by constant warfare, was completely unable to organize any effective relief for the suffering population. The authority of the Sultan crumbled in the face of such widespread misery. On the heels of this terrible famine came another of the four horsemen of the apocalypse pestilence. The Black Death, the great plague that had devastated the world in the mid-14th century, had never truly gone away. It returned periodically in fresh outbreaks, and a population weakened by years of famine was tragically vulnerable. Starting around 1405, a new wave of the plague swept through Egypt. It killed indiscriminately, striking down the poor and the powerful alike. It is estimated that this outbreak may have carried off as much as 1/3 of the population of Cairo, a city already reeling from hunger and political violence. For Sultan Faraj, these events were an unmitigated disaster. A ruler's legitimacy was often seen as a reflection of divine favor. A prosperous kingdom with full harvests was a sign of a righteous sultan. A kingdom racked by famine, plague, and civil war was seen as a sign of a ruler who had lost God's blessing. The people suffered immensely, and their anger and desperation were directed at the Sultan. The Mamluk emirs, always looking for an opportunity to advance their own ambitions, used the widespread suffering as a weapon against Faraj. They blamed him for the disasters, claiming his misrule and impiety had brought this divine punishment upon the land. The foundations of his rule were rotting away. Faced with a rebellious Syria, a starving Egypt, and a treasury that was all but empty, Sultan Faraj grew increasingly desperate. The measured, cunning political ruler he had become was slowly replaced by a ruler who was paranoid, erratic, and often cruel. One of his biggest problems was money. The constant civil wars, the lavish lifestyles of the Mamluk elite, and the loss of trade revenue from a devastated Syria had bankrupted the state. To raise funds, Faraj resorted to increasingly oppressive and unpopular measures. He imposed heavy, extraordinary taxes on the general population, merchants, and even religious endowments. These financial policies were not only ruinous for the economy, but also alienated key segments of society. The ulema, the class of religious scholars who held significant moral authority, were outraged by the seizure of funds from religious foundations. The merchants, who were the lifeblood of Cairo's economy, were crippled by the constant demands for money. Faraj also engaged in the practice of musadara, which was essentially the official extortion of wealthy individuals. His officials would arrest rich emirs, bureaucrats, or merchants and torture them until they confessed where their fortunes were hidden. This created an atmosphere of terror among the elite and destroyed any remaining loyalty they might have had to him. His behavior became more and more unpredictable. He would grant favor to an emir one day, only to have him arrested and executed the next. This paranoia was fueled by the very real plots that were constantly swirling around him. The two emirs, who would eventually bring him down, Sheikh al-Mahmudi and Nawruz al-Hafizi, were both former allies whom Faraj had promoted. They were the governors of the key Syrian cities of Damascus and Aleppo. They had watched his erratic behavior and his attacks on other emirs, and they knew it was only a matter of time before he turned on them. They decided they had to strike first. Instead of trying to forge alliances and rebuild his kingdom, Faraj's desperation led him down a path of self-destruction. He trusted no one, and therefore had no one he could truly rely on. His attempts to centralize power by eliminating the powerful emirs had backfired spectacularly. All he had managed to do was unite them against him. His kingdom was broken, his people were suffering, and his most powerful governors in Syria were now openly plotting a full-scale rebellion. The final act of his tragic reign was about to begin, set in motion not just by his enemies, but by his own mistakes born of desperation. The final challenge to Sultan Faraj's rule came, once again, from Syria. The two powerful governors, Sheikh al-Mahmudi in Damascus and Nawruz al-Hafizi in Aleppo, had been consolidating their power and building an alliance. They had seen what happened to other emirs who fell out of favor with the volatile sultan, and they were not going to wait for the axe to fall on them. In 1412, they openly declared their rebellion against Faraj, accusing him of misrule, impiety, and causing the ruin of the kingdom. They declared him deposed and began to march their combined armies south towards Cairo, calling on other emirs to join their cause. Faraj, for his part, was not one to back down from a fight. He had survived rebellions before, and he gathered what loyal Mamluk forces he could muster in Cairo and marched out to confront the rebels. This time, however, the situation was different. His support base was dangerously thin. Years of purges, executions, and financial extortion had eroded his support among the Mamluk elite in Cairo. Many emirs who marched with him were doing so reluctantly, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The morale of his army was low, a stark contrast to the determined forces of Sheikh and Nowruz, who were fighting for their survival. The decisive confrontation took place at Lajun, in Palestine. It was not a grand battle, but a messy and confused affair that quickly revealed the weakness of Faraj's position. During the battle, large numbers of his emirs and their personal troops defected to the rebel side. Seeing his army dissolving before his very eyes, Faraj knew the fight was lost. He fled the battlefield, not back to Cairo where he knew he would find no safety, but to Damascus, the city now controlled by his enemy. He sought refuge in the city's citadel, perhaps hoping to negotiate a surrender or find some last vestige of support. It was a futile hope. He was trapped. Sheikh and Nowruz laid siege to the citadel, and Faraj's last remaining followers soon abandoned him. The rebels proclaimed the Caliph al-Musta'in as a temporary sultan, a highly unusual move designed to give their rebellion a cloak of legitimacy. Faraj was finally forced to surrender. He was put on trial, with the caliph and the rebel emirs acting as his judges. He was charged with a long list of crimes, from the ruin of the economy to the shedding of Muslim blood. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Sultan Nasir al-Din Faraj was condemned to death. In May 1412, he was killed in prison. His body was left in a ditch, a miserable end for a man who had been the sultan of a great empire for most of his life. What then is the legacy of Sultan Faraj? For centuries, historians, particularly the Mamluk chroniclers who wrote shortly after his death, painted a bleak picture. They portrayed him as a weak, ineffective, and cruel ruler whose reign was an unmitigated disaster for Egypt and Syria. They blamed him for the famine, the plague, the destruction of Damascus, and the collapse of the economy. In their telling, his downfall was a just punishment for his many sins and failures. He became a cautionary tale, a symbol of a dysfunctional reign that brought the Mamluk Sultanate to one of its lowest points. However, a more modern and nuanced view offers a slightly different perspective. While no one can deny the disasters that occurred during his time, it is fairer to see Faraj as a product of his circumstances as much as the cause of them. He was, after all, placed on the throne as a 10-year-old boy in one of the most violent and politically unstable systems imaginable. He inherited a kingdom that was already rife with factionalism. The devastating invasion of Timur was not something he could have prevented, and the subsequent abandonment of Damascus was the decision of his treacherous regents, not his own. The cycles of plague and famine were also largely beyond his control. Where Faraj can be faulted is in his response to these crises. His paranoia, his financial extortion, and his execution of so many emirs were disastrous policies. He failed to unite the kingdom when it needed unity most. Yet, we must also acknowledge his incredible resilience. He survived for over a decade as sultan, navigating deadly court intrigues from childhood. He was even overthrown and managed to fight his way back to power, a remarkable feat in the Mamluk world. He was clearly not a weak or stupid man, but a hardened survivor. Ultimately, the story of Sultan Nasir al-Din Faraj is a profound tragedy. It is the story of a boy who was given a crown, but never a chance to rule peacefully. His life is a dramatic illustration of the inherent flaws of the late Mamluk Sultanate. The system that had produced the great warriors who defeated the Mongols was now consuming itself through endless internal conflict. Sheikh al-Mahmudi, the man who overthrew Faraj, would become the next sultan, and his reign would bring a period of relative stability. But the cycle of violence and intrigue would continue. Faraj's story matters because it shows us, in stark human terms, how even the most powerful empires can be brought to the brink of collapse, not just by foreign invaders, but by their own internal divisions.